It was just after noon on a busy Tuesday when Officer Samantha Reed noticed the commotion. The spring sun shone brightly overhead as she patrolled the bustling downtown area of Greenfield. At 34 years old, with 8 years on the force, she had seen her share of trouble, but something about the raised voices coming from outside Maple Street Cafe caught her attention immediately. A tall man with a red face stood over a family of 4. The parents tried to shield their 2 children, a boy around 7 and a girl who couldn't have been more than 5. The family wore traditional clothing that marked them as immigrants from the Middle East. The man jabbed his finger in the father's face, his voice carrying across the street. "Go back where you came from. We don't want your kind here." People walked by quickly, looking down at their phones or suddenly finding interest in store windows. No one stopped. No one helped. Officer Reed felt her heart rate quicken. This wasn't just another disturbance call. The pure hatred in the man's voice and the fear in the children's eyes made her blood boil. She touched her radio and called in her position before crossing the street with purposeful strides. "I pay taxes here. You probably don't even have real papers," the man shouted, his spit landing on the father's cheek. The father didn't move to wipe it away. He just stood perfectly still, one arm around his wife, the other pushing his children behind him. Reed approached from the side, taking in the whole scene. The aggressor was a white man in his 40s, well-dressed in khaki pants and a button-down shirt. He carried a leather briefcase that suggested he worked in an office nearby. This wasn't some obvious troublemaker. He looked like anyone you might pass on the street or sit next to in a meeting. "Excuse me," Reed said firmly. "What seems to be the problem here?" The man spun around, momentarily surprised to see her uniform. His surprise quickly turned to a smirk. "Oh good, someone who can actually do something about these people." Reed positioned herself between the man and the family. She could feel the children peeking out from behind their parents. The little girl clutched a stuffed animal so tightly that her knuckles were white. "Sir, I need you to step back and lower your voice," Reed said calmly. The man's face darkened. "Do you know what these people are doing to our country, taking our jobs, bringing their problems here? And now we have women cops defending them." Reed noticed a small crowd forming. Some had phones out, recording the scene. She knew that whatever happened next might end up online, but more importantly, she knew those children were watching to see if the world would protect them or if the angry man's words represented how their new home truly felt about them. "Sir, I need to see some identification," Reed said, keeping her voice level despite the anger rising inside her. "You want my ID? Why don't you check theirs?" he shouted, pointing again at the family. The mother pulled her children closer. The father stood tall but said nothing, his eyes reflecting both dignity and deep sadness. Reed took a deep breath. In 8 years of police work, she had learned that the next few moments of any confrontation often determined how things would end. She needed to take control of this situation before it escalated further, but she also needed to show these children, and everyone watching, what justice really looked like. The man stepped toward her, entering her personal space. "Well, what are you going to do about it, officer?" Officer Reed didn't step back. 10 years of training had taught her that showing weakness now would only make things worse. Instead, she stood her ground, her eyes locked with the angry man's. "Sir, this is your final warning. Step back and show me your ID." Her voice remained calm but carried a new edge of authority. The man, later identified as James Wilson, scoffed. "Or what? You'll arrest me for speaking the truth? Last I checked, free speech was still a right in this country." By now, the crowd had grown. At least 15 people stood watching, most with phones raised. A young woman in a cafe apron had stepped outside, concern written across her face. Reed noticed she was specifically watching the frightened family, not the confrontation itself. "I'm asking you to step back because you're causing a disturbance," Reed explained. "Freedom of speech doesn't cover harassment or threatening behavior." Wilson laughed, but there was something desperate in the sound. "Threatening? I haven't touched anybody." Behind Reed, the father of the family quietly spoke for the first time. His English was perfect, with just a hint of an accent. "We were just having lunch. We didn't do anything to this man." This seemed to enrage Wilson further. "You exist. That's what you're doing. Taking over our neighborhoods, not even trying to fit in." Reed noticed the mother whispering something comforting to her children in their native language. The little boy was crying silently, tears streaming down his face while he tried to be brave. A decision point had arrived. Reed could feel it in her bones. This moment would define not just how this incident ended, but what message those children would carry with them about authority, about protection, about America itself. She reached for her radio while keeping her eyes on Wilson. "Dispatch, this is Officer Reed. I'm going to need backup at Maple Street Cafe. Situation currently under control but escalating." The radio crackled. "Copy that, Officer Reed. Units are 3 minutes out." Wilson's face flushed deeper red. "You're calling backup? For what? Because I said something you don't like. This is police overreach. I know my rights." Reed took out her notebook, a deliberate action meant to show this was now an official police matter. "Sir, I need your name and ID." "James Wilson. I work at First National Bank right down the street. I'm a taxpayer, a voter, and a citizen, which is more than I can say for them." He jerked his head toward the family, but didn't move to get his ID. The cafe worker who had been watching approached cautiously. "Officer, these folks are regular customers here. They come every Tuesday with their kids. They've never caused any problems." Wilson spun toward her. "Oh great, another bleeding heart. You probably let them use your bathroom without buying anything too." The young woman flinched but stood her ground. "Actually, sir, they'd always order the same thing. Hummus plate, 2 orange juices, and milk for the kids. They tip well and clean up after themselves, unlike some people." Reed noticed a shift in the crowd's energy. Murmurs of support for the family began to ripple through the onlookers. Several people nodded at the cafe worker's words. Wilson sensed the change too. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across his face. He was no longer controlling the narrative. Reed saw her opening. "Mr. Wilson, we can continue this conversation at the station, or you can provide your ID and move along peacefully. Your choice, but I need an answer now." Wilson's eyes darted from Reed to the crowd to the family. The sound of approaching sirens in the distance made his decision more urgent. What happened next would shape everyone involved for years to come. Wilson's hand moved slowly toward his back pocket. The tension in the air thickened as Officer Reed watched his every move. Some in the crowd stepped back, unsure of what might happen next. "Easy now," Reed said, her right hand instinctively shifting closer to her belt. Wilson pulled out his wallet with a dramatic sigh and practically threw his driver's license at Reed. "Happy now? Harassing a law-abiding citizen while real criminals run free." Reed caught the ID smoothly and examined it. "James Wilson, 46, local address in the wealthy part of town." The photo matched the red-faced man before her. She wrote the information in her notebook while keeping him in her peripheral vision. "Thank you for your cooperation, Mr. Wilson," she said professionally, handing the license back. "Now I'd like to hear exactly what happened here from the beginning." The wail of sirens grew louder. Wilson's eyes darted toward the sound, then back to Reed. "Nothing happened. I was just expressing my opinion about immigration policies when these people took offense." He gestured dismissively toward the family. "Then you showed up and escalated everything." The father of the family stepped forward slightly, keeping his family behind him. "Officer, if I may." "You may not," Wilson snapped. "This is between me and the officer now." Reed raised her hand. "Actually, sir, I need to hear from everyone involved." She nodded respectfully to the father. "Please, go ahead." The father spoke calmly despite the situation. "My name is Dr. Ahmed Hassan. I am a surgeon at Memorial Hospital. We were simply having our lunch when this man approached our table and began shouting at us to go back to our country." His voice remained steady, but pain showed in his eyes. "We have lived here for 6 years. My children were born here. This is our country." Several people in the crowd nodded in support. One elderly woman said loudly, "That's right. I've seen the doctor at church events. Lovely family." Wilson's face darkened again. "Of course you all take their side. That's what's wrong with this country now." A police cruiser pulled up to the curb, and 2 officers stepped out, Rodriguez and Chen, both veterans on the force whom Reed knew well. They approached with measured steps, taking in the scene. "What's the situation, Reed?" Rodriguez asked, his experienced eyes already scanning the group. Before Reed could answer, Wilson jumped in. "These officers are violating my constitutional rights. I want to file a complaint." Officer Chen turned to Reed with a questioning look. Reed gave a slight shake of her head and a meaningful glance toward the Hassan family. "Mr. Wilson was harassing this family with racist language," Reed explained professionally. "When I asked him to stop, he became confrontational." "That's a lie," Wilson shouted. "This is police brutality." Chen raised an eyebrow. "Sir, nobody has touched you." The little girl, who had been hiding behind her mother, suddenly spoke up in a small voice. "He called us bad people. He said we should go away forever." Her lip trembled as she clutched her stuffed animal tighter. "But my teacher says America is for everybody who follows the rules. We follow the rules." A hush fell over the crowd. The simple truth from a child's mouth seemed to hang in the air. Wilson opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the first time, he looked uncertain. Reed knelt down to the little girl's eye level. "Your teacher is right. And you're not going anywhere because this is your home." Standing back up, Reed turned to Wilson with new resolve in her eyes. "Mr. Wilson, you have two options now. Option 1, I can cite you for disturbing the peace and harassment, which will require a court appearance. Option 2, you leave the area immediately and do not approach this family again." Wilson looked at the three officers, the supportive crowd, and the calm dignity of the Hassan family. His next words would determine far more than just what happened in the next few minutes. Wilson's face twisted with anger as he looked from the officers to the crowd to the Hassan family. The presence of additional police officers should have calmed him, but instead, he seemed to grow more agitated, like a cornered animal. "This is ridiculous. I'm being ganged up on because I spoke the truth that nobody wants to hear." He pointed at Dr. Hassan. "People like him are taking jobs from real Americans." Officer Rodriguez stepped forward. "Sir, I'm going to need you to lower your voice." Wilson ignored him, turning back to Officer Reed. "You think you're so righteous, don't you? Playing hero for these people while hard-working citizens like me get pushed aside?" Reed kept her voice level. "This isn't about heroes, Mr. Wilson. This is about basic respect and following the law." "The law?" Wilson laughed bitterly. "What about the laws they broke coming here?" Dr. Hassan spoke up again, his voice tired but firm. "My family immigrated legally. I completed my medical training here and now serve as a trauma surgeon. I save American lives every day." A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. Several people nodded. An older man in a veteran's cap spoke up. "I had surgery last year at Memorial. Might been you who fixed me up, Doc." Wilson's face grew redder. He seemed to realize he was losing the public's support with each passing moment. He jabbed a finger toward Officer Reed. "You've made a big mistake. My brother-in-law is on the city council. When he hears about this..." "When he hears what exactly?" Reed interrupted. "That you are harassing a doctor and his family in public. That you refuse to comply with a police officer's lawful orders. Please, tell your brother-in-law everything. I'd be happy to provide my body camera footage." Wilson's eyes darted to the camera on Reed's uniform, as if noticing it for the first time. The realization that his entire tirade had been recorded seemed to sink in slowly. The little boy who had been quiet throughout the confrontation suddenly tugged on his father's sleeve and whispered something. Dr. Hassan bent down to listen, then smiled sadly and nodded. "My son has something he would like to say," Dr. Hassan announced. "If that's all right, officer?" Reed nodded, curious. Officer Chen positioned himself protectively closer to the family, just in case. The boy, around 7 years old, stepped forward slightly. He looked at Wilson without fear, just confusion in his young eyes. "My dad helps people when they're hurt," he said in a clear voice. "He doesn't ask if they're from here or not. He just helps them. That's what my mom and dad taught me, to help people if I can." He paused, then asked with genuine curiosity, "Why don't you like us helping people?" Wilson stared at the boy, his mouth opening and closing without words coming out. For the first time, he seemed to truly see the family as people, not as a symbol or a political talking point, but as human beings standing in front of him. Several onlookers had tears in their eyes. The cafe worker who had spoken up earlier wiped her cheek with her apron. "Mr. Wilson," Officer Reed said quietly, "I'm still waiting for your decision. Will you be leaving peacefully, or would you prefer to continue this conversation at the station?" The fight seemed to drain out of Wilson all at once. His shoulders slumped slightly. "I'll go," he muttered, avoiding everyone's eyes. Smart choice, Officer Rodriguez said. Officer Chen will walk you to your car. As Chen stepped forward to escort Wilson away, Reed noticed a middle-aged woman break from the crowd and approach Wilson. Her face was stern but not unkind. James Wilson, I'm Elizabeth Martin. I work with your wife at the bank. I recognize you from the Christmas party. She looked him straight in the eye. I'm going to pretend I didn't see this today when I see her tomorrow, but I suggest you take a hard look at yourself on the drive home. Wilson's face drained of color. The confrontation had just become personal in a way he hadn't anticipated. The crowd parted as Officer Chen led a now silent Wilson away from the scene. But everyone knew this story was far from over. As Wilson walked away with Officer Chen, the tension in the air began to lift. People in the crowd started talking among themselves, some approaching Dr. Hassan and his family to offer words of support. Officer Reed watched the scene with a mixture of relief and concern. The immediate danger had passed, but she knew situations like this left invisible wounds that weren't so easily healed. We'll need statements from everyone involved, Officer Rodriguez said quietly to Reed. I'll start with some of these witnesses if you want to talk to the family. Reed nodded and approached the Hassans. The mother was now sitting on a bench outside the cafe, her arms around both children. Dr. Hassan stood beside them, his hand resting protectively on his wife's shoulder. I want to apologize for what happened here today, Reed said as she reached them. No one should have to experience that kind of treatment, especially not children. Mrs. Hassan looked up, her eyes tired but grateful. Thank you for stepping in, officer. Many people would have just walked by. That's actually what we'd like to talk about, Dr. Hassan said, his voice low so the children wouldn't hear. This isn't the first time something like this has happened. It's just the first time a police officer was nearby. Reed felt her heart sink. How often do incidents like this occur? Not every day, Mrs. Hassan replied, but enough that my children ask why some people look at us with angry eyes. Enough that we choose our restaurants and shopping centers carefully. She gently stroked her daughter's hair. Enough that I practiced what to tell them when it happens. The little girl looked up at Officer Reed with curious eyes. Are you going to put that mean man in jail? Reed knelt down to the child's level. No, sweetie. What he did was wrong, but not something we put people in jail for. But we did make sure he understood that his behavior isn't acceptable, and there are consequences for treating people unkindly. Like a timeout? The boy asked, seeming to understand. Reed smiled. Something like that, yes. As they spoke, the cafe worker who had defended the family earlier approached with a tray. On it were 2 fresh orange juices, 2 milk cartons, and a large hummus plate with extra pita bread. Your usual order, she said with a warm smile, on the house today. That's very kind, but not necessary, Dr. Hassan began. The young woman shook her head firmly. It absolutely is necessary. We want you to know that you're valued customers and... She glanced at the children. That man doesn't speak for this community. Reed watched as other cafe patrons nodded in agreement. An elderly couple at a nearby table raised their coffee cups in a small salute of solidarity. While the family accepted the food with thanks, Reed stepped aside to write up her report. Officer Rodriguez joined her a few minutes later. Got statements from 6 witnesses, he said. All consistent. Wilson approached them unprovoked and started making racist comments. The family never responded aggressively. Reed nodded, making notes. Any history on Wilson we should know about? Rodriguez checked his tablet. Just ran him. No priors, but there was a workplace complaint filed against him last year for creating a hostile environment. Nothing came of it officially. Reed looked back at the Hassan family. The children were eating now, some of their natural childhood energy returning as they dipped bread into the hummus. Dr. Hassan caught her eye and nodded gratefully. We'll follow up on this, Reed promised. The department has been working with community leaders on addressing hate incidents. This is exactly the kind of situation our new protocols were designed for. As she finished her paperwork, Reed noticed something unexpected. The crowd that had gathered hadn't fully dispersed. Instead, several people had joined the Hassan family at their table. The elderly veteran was showing the little boy something in his wallet, probably pictures of grandchildren. A young mother had her own children sitting with the Hassan kids, sharing a plate of cookies. What had started as an ugly confrontation had transformed into something else entirely, a spontaneous demonstration of what community really meant. It wasn't the ending Reed had expected when she first heard Wilson's angry voice across the street, but it was infinitely better. And somewhere in the back of her mind, Reed wondered what Wilson would think if he could see this scene now. 3 days after the incident, Officer Reed sat at her desk completing paperwork from the morning patrol. The events outside Maple Street Cafe had not faded from her mind. In fact, they had taken on a life of their own in ways she hadn't anticipated. The department phone rang. "Officer Reed," she answered professionally. "Officer Reed, this is Captain Lawson. Can you come to my office when you have a moment?" Reed felt a twinge of concern. Captain Lawson rarely called officers directly unless there was an issue. "I'll be right there, sir." As she walked through the station, Reed noticed several colleagues glancing her way. Some nodded with what looked like approval, while others quickly looked away. Something was definitely going on. She knocked on the captain's door and entered when called. Inside, Captain Lawson sat behind his desk with a serious expression. Next to him stood Chief Garcia, the head of the entire department. "Have a seat, Reed," Captain Lawson said, gesturing to the chair in front of his desk. Reed sat down, back straight, trying to read their expressions. "Is there a problem, sir?" Chief Garcia leaned forward slightly. "Are you aware that your interaction with James Wilson and the Hassan family has gone viral?" Reed blinked in surprise. "No, sir, I haven't been on social media lately." Captain Lawson turned his computer monitor so she could see the screen. On it was a video titled, "Officer Stands Up to Racist Bully, Restores Faith in Humanity." The view count was over 2 million. "Someone compiled footage from several bystanders and posted it online," the chief explained. "It's been picked up by local news and is spreading nationally." Reed watched a portion of the video, seeing herself from different angles as she confronted Wilson and spoke with the Hassan family. The editing clearly portrayed her as the hero of the situation. "I was just doing my job," she said quietly. "That's exactly why we wanted to talk to you," Captain Lawson replied. "Your handling of the situation exemplifies the kind of community policing we've been trying to implement. You de-escalated without force, showed respect to all parties, and represented the department with professionalism." Chief Garcia nodded in agreement. "We've received dozens of emails praising your actions. The mayor called this morning to express his appreciation." Reed felt a mix of pride and discomfort. "Thank you, but I wasn't looking for recognition." "We know that," the chief said. "But in today's climate, positive stories about police interactions matter. The mayor has asked if you would be willing to speak at a community forum on improving police-community relations next month." Before Reed could respond, Captain Lawson added, "There's something else you should know. Dr. Hassan has filed an official commendation for your actions that day." He handed her a letter. As Reed read Dr. Hassan's words describing how her intervention had made his family feel safe and respected in their community, unexpected emotion tightened her throat. "There's one more thing," Chief Garcia said, his tone changing slightly. "Wilson has filed a complaint against you, claiming harassment and violation of his free speech rights." Reed's head snapped up. "Sir, I followed protocol exactly." The chief raised his hand to stop her. "We know. Your body camera footage confirms it. The complaint won't go anywhere, but I wanted you to be aware." Captain Lawson leaned forward. "Actually, this leads to why we really called you in. The department is creating a new community outreach unit focused on hate crime prevention and response. Given your handling of this situation, we'd like you to consider joining the team." Reed sat back, surprised. She had applied for specialized units before, but had always been passed over for officers with more seniority. It would mean different hours, the captain continued. More community meetings, some public speaking, but also more opportunity to make the kind of difference you made that day. As Reed considered the offer, her phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced down to see it was from Officer Rodriguez. "Check your email. The Hassan kids made you something." Looking back at her superiors, Reed realized that one incident on a sunny afternoon had possibly changed the course of her career, and perhaps more importantly, had shown her the true impact one officer could have. "I'd like some time to think about it," she said carefully, "but I'm definitely interested." 1 week later, Officer Reed sat in her patrol car outside Greenfield Elementary School. She checked her watch. 2:45 p.m., almost dismissal time. This wasn't part of her regular duties, but she had requested an hour of personal time for this visit. The school bell rang, and within minutes, children poured out of the building. Reed stepped out of her car, straightening her uniform. Several parents noticed her and whispered among themselves. The video had made her recognizable in ways she wasn't entirely comfortable with. "Officer Reed." A small voice called out. Amira Hassan, the little girl from the cafe incident, ran toward her with excitement, her brother Zain close behind. Dr. Hassan followed at a more measured pace, smiling warmly. Reed knelt down as Amira reached her. "Hello there, I got your beautiful drawing. Did you make that all by yourself?" Amira nodded proudly. "I drew you and my family in the cafe. Ms. Miller helped me spell thank you in big letters." The drawing had arrived in Reed's email. A colorful picture showing stick figures of the Hassan family, Reed in a blue uniform, and the cafe with a bright yellow sun overhead. It now hung on Reed's refrigerator at home. "I have something for both of you," Reed said, reaching into her pocket. She pulled out 2 junior police badges, plastic replicas that the department gave out at community events. "These are special thank you badges for being so brave that day." The children's eyes widened as she pinned the badges to their backpacks. Zane looked at his with wonder. "Does this mean we help protect people too?" Reed smiled. "That's exactly what it means. Anyone can help protect their community, not just police officers." Dr. Hassan reached them and extended his hand. "Officer Reed, this visit is unexpected but very welcome. The children have talked about you all week." Reed shook his hand. "I wanted to check in and see how everyone was doing." "We are well," he replied, then lowered his voice. "Though I must admit, becoming somewhat famous overnight has been interesting." Reed nodded in understanding. Like her, the Hassan family had been thrust into the spotlight by the viral video. "Has there been any backlash?" "Some," Dr. Hassan admitted. "A few angry messages at the hospital. But for every negative comment, we've received 20 positive ones." He smiled slightly. "The hospital administrator has asked me to join the diversity committee, which I've been trying to do for 2 years." Other parents and children had gathered around them, some asking to take pictures with Officer Reed. She politely declined photos but chatted with several families who wanted to express their support. As the crowd thinned, Dr. Hassan asked, "Have you heard anything more about Mr. Wilson?" Reed hesitated, waiting how much to share. "He withdrew his complaint against me, and I've heard through department channels that he's been placed on leave from his job pending an investigation." Dr. Hassan nodded thoughtfully. "My wife says we should pray for him." "Your wife sounds like a wise woman," Reed replied. "She is," he agreed. "She also says that people like Mr. Wilson are often fighting battles we know nothing about. It doesn't excuse their behavior, but it helps us understand it." As they talked, Reed noticed a familiar car parking across the street. Officer Rodriguez stepped out and waved. She had almost forgotten he was picking her up to return to the station. "I should go," Reed said, "but I wanted you to know that I've accepted a position with our new community outreach unit. I'll be working with schools and community groups on preventing and responding to hate incidents." Dr. Hassan's face brightened. "That is excellent news, Officer Reed. The right person for the right job." As Reed said goodbye to the family, Amira suddenly hugged her around the legs. "Will you come visit our class someday? Miss Miller says police officers are community helpers, and you're the best one." Reed felt something catch in her throat as she gently patted the little girl's back. "I think that could definitely be arranged." Walking back to meet Rodriguez, Reed reflected on how a single incident, 20 minutes out of her entire career, had created ripples that continued to spread outward. The new position, the Hassan family, the community response, all from one decision to step forward instead of walking past. 6 months after the incident at Maple Street Cafe, Officer Samantha Reid stood at a podium in Greenfield Community Center. The room was filled with nearly 200 people, community members, police officers, local officials, and families from diverse backgrounds. A banner hung above the stage reading "Building Bridges, Greenfield United Against Hate." Reed adjusted the microphone, her new community outreach unit badge gleaming on her uniform. This was the fourth such community forum she had helped organize, but tonight was special. Tonight, she would share the stage with someone unexpected. "Thank you all for coming," Reed began. "When we started these conversations 6 months ago, we had about 30 people in attendance. Look at us now." She gestured to the packed room, drawing applause. From her position, Wright could see the Hassan family sitting in the front row. Amira waved enthusiastically, still wearing her junior police badge on her jacket. Next to them sat Officer Rodriguez and several other officers who had volunteered their off-duty time to attend. "Today, we're going to do something different," Reed continued. "We often talk about the importance of accountability, forgiveness, and second chances. Tonight, we put those values into practice." She took a deep breath. "I'd like to introduce someone who has asked to speak with you. Many of you will recognize him from an incident that, frankly, brought us all together in the first place. I ask that you listen with open hearts, just as you've asked others to listen to you." Reed stepped back from the podium as James Wilson walked onto the stage. The room fell silent. Wilson looked different than he had 6 months ago, thinner, somewhat older, his face no longer red with anger but pale with nervousness. He approached the microphone slowly. "Thank you, Officer Reed." His voice shook slightly. "I know many of you are wondering why I'm here, or perhaps why I was allowed to be here." Wilson gripped the sides of the podium. 6 months ago, I verbally attacked a family outside a cafe. You've probably seen the video. I know my mother has, my boss has, my neighbors have. He attempted a small, sad smile. It's not easy being the villain in a viral video. Several people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The room remained silent. "I'm not here to make excuses," Wilson continued. "After that day, I lost my job. My wife left me. I received death threats. For a while, I blamed everyone else for what happened to me." He paused. "It took losing nearly everything to realize that I was the problem." Wilson looked directly at the Hassan family. "Dr. Hassan, Mrs. Hassan, what I did was inexcusable. I directed my frustrations about my own life at you because you were an easy target. I judged you without knowing anything about you." Mrs. Hassan nodded slightly, her expression unreadable. Dr. Hassan kept his arm around his wife's shoulders. 3 months ago, I started attending anger management classes and joined a community dialogue group," Wilson explained. "Last month, Officer Reed agreed to meet with me. I asked if there was anything I could do to make amends. She suggested I start by facing the community I hurt." Reed watched the audience carefully. Some faces showed skepticism, others surprise, a few showed signs of forgiveness. "I don't expect forgiveness," Wilson said, his voice stronger now. "I just want you to know that people can change. I've changed, and I'm committed to continuing that change." He stepped back from the microphone, and Reed returned to the podium. "Thank you, Mr. Wilson," she said. "Change isn't easy, and public accountability is even harder." She turned to the audience. "When I became a police officer, I thought my job was simply to enforce laws. But I've learned that true community safety isn't just about punishing wrongdoing. It's about healing harm and preventing future damage." Reed gestured to the diverse crowd. "Look around this room. This is what a community looks like when it refuses to be divided by hate." After the forum ended, Reed watched as something remarkable happened. Dr. Hassan approached Wilson. They didn't embrace or even shake hands, but they spoke quietly for several minutes. It wasn't a Hollywood ending with instant forgiveness, but it was something real, the beginning of understanding. As people filed out of the community center, Amira ran up to Reed one last time. "Officer Reed, my dad says sometimes bad days can lead to good things. Is that true?" Reed knelt down to meet the child's eyes. "Your dad is a very wise man, Amira. Yes, sometimes the hardest moments can lead to the most important changes." As Reed watched the Hassan family leave with several neighbors, she realized that this story, which had begun with hatred, had transformed into something else entirely, a community finding its courage, its voice, and ultimately, its heart.